Mojo Monday, Rick Hale. How
Mojo.
I got Mojo.
It's funny. Words are only fun when you make them fun. Otherwise, they're just letters put together, consonants, vowels. But Mojo. That
But
felt good. Thank you.
it almost sounds like a little bit of the cadence of a rap song. Like I always enamored when people could talk really, really, really fast. I don't know that that's necessarily my skill set that I bring to this equation, but we'll
It
go there.
clearly buried in their natural gifts and their 10,000 hours of self-discovery and practice.
There you go. I love it. Today's topic, Mr. Hale, is this theory called the four burners theory. And we're going to dive into this. It speaks really loud. And I don't know why. This one spoke pretty loud to me. We've talked topics that are like, man, those are really great ideas. Those are profound ideas. But this one kind of gets into the inner soul a little bit around how life goes and how it gives you a perspective of life, right? However, we wanted to start, as we always do, with a little did you know? And Rick punted the football to me
I
to
did.
bring
It's
the
your
did
week.
you know to the table today. So the question we will answer at the end is, did you know when the modern kitchen came to be?
Hmm.
At what point in history did the modern kitchen come to be? And it's tied to the four burner theory. I'm not sure. We'll hold that teaser till the end. Rick, four burners. The analogy of this is the four burners on a stove, right? It's in a kitchen. In a kitchen, you got a stove, and it's got four burners on it. Why don't you set our topic up today?
So the theory is that, and I've actually not researched the theory, but I'm going to say that I buy in and believe it. But in most cases, there's a limited amount of gas available to a stove, and each of the four burners has a specific function, and we'll talk about that in a second. And but if you turn one up to full blast, and by the way, mine actually has a super burner, but let's assume they're all equally capable of low, medium, and high. If you turn two or three up to high, the fourth one is going to suffer because there's not enough gas available. So it's impossible to run all four burners at the extreme heat that its capacity would allow. And so in the four burners, each of the four represents a quadrant of life. So as opposed to the wheel of life, which I've used many times in coaching and training, this is a more simplified approach. And I think there's real merit in boiling it down, if you will, using the burner strategy into a little more condensed perspective.
Yeah, and I think we got to throw credit. It was originally written by a guy named David Sedaris, if you're familiar with David Sedaris, but it was also mentioned in the book Atomic Habits by
Hmm.
James Clear. And it's just a really profound theory, right? So the theory is there's four burners in our life. And Rick, we've talked that there's subcategories, but the way they position the four burners is work, family, health, and friends. And those are kind of the big chunked up categories. And then there's certainly subcategories inside all of those. And if you subscribe to this theory, you can't burn hot in all four categories at the same time, is really what the theory makes mention. What do you say?
Well, it does actually allow for all four to run, but if you run all four, they're going to all be low to medium heat. None are going to burn super hot, which implies you're not going to crush that category in a way, that you dominate that goal. In other words, you compromise everywhere, you'll end up compromised. It's that it aligns well with the idea, jack of all trades, master of none. And so the premise is life is most fulfilled when you master quadrants or areas. And then once you master it, the idea also is that you can turn it down and put it on simmer and it still runs hot.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the strategies here because uh, I think most people have a human experience and they want to believe that they can balance their life in all areas, right?
Hmm.
And even when you teach the wheel of life exercise, we kind of put the numbers and then people have this aha that their wheel's not very round, right?
That is,
So just
yep.
that aha alone says you're not really going to be able to be optimal in all categories at the same time, right? And is that good or bad? Debatable, right? Counterbalancing is probably a real concept versus having a fully balanced life at any given one moment. What would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. And also that, there's seasons of life, which is actually strategy one we're going to talk about, where certain priorities are more important, or things in life that become priorities are your paramount mount. That's the mountain right in front of you. You have to climb before other mountains are available, or before, if, as a quick example, if your work and financial capacity isn't fulfilled and that's not knocked down, a lot of the other things in life aren't able to be funded effectively or to the standard or level that you want. So that
Yeah.
could be one of those where, you've created a priority because of a season of life. And when I coach to the wheel of life, I also, one of the first things I say is, rate yourself 1 to 10. Make sure you're rating yourself against your perspective and what you want from life. Not, don't judge your insides by other people's outsides or their perfect day on social media. Make sure that your 10 is relative to your ideal, perfect landing or perfect place of self-discovered truth of, optimized outcomes. And so your 10 is your 10. And then I also say one thing else I share that, sometimes if a category doesn't even matter in that moment, then stop grading harshly. Don't judge yourself for something that's not a priority.
There you go. Well, let's jump into our five strategies here. So
Do
you
it.
already made mention. Strategy one is know your season of life. And you kind of think as we evolve as in our human experience, when you're a young adult, your friends are probably one of the hottest burners in your life, right? Like you growing up, you're in high school, friends is like a thing, right? And you hang out with your friends a lot. But then there's always that person that gets into a relationship and all of a sudden they abandon their friends. Well, they just basically turned down the burner on friends and turned up the burner on family or relationships or whatever. But you go through a different season. You may go into university, right? You get into university and you certainly have your friend circle, but if you're in like a tough class or a tough graduate program, you're going to have to go all in on that experience at that season of life. And you're probably neglecting your friends. You probably wouldn't be able to be optimal in a work environment at that moment in time because it's dedication, right? Like that season of your life is dedication. And hopefully you find yourself sometimes as a young professional, and that is a season that you need to turn the burner up on the work aspect. What do you make of all this?
Well, and when you're young, you can also compromise health. I don't know about you, but when I was juggling, I had to work to pay for college, and I still wanted a social life because I was social. So I kind of turned down the health, burner, and ended up, I lost some sleep. I did some all-nighters before a big exam. And,
Yeah.
the good news is, depending on the season, the next thing we're going to talk about will help you clarify that. But, at that point, I had the recovery and the capacity because of my age and, just being a young person. You can you can fumble the health ball a few times when you're really young, but I think later in life, maybe, the season changes and your priorities have to change. So it's important to recognize exactly what season you're in, because not only are you chasing the bonus or the benefit of being focused and making it a priority, but you also don't want the regret of letting something slip that's really should have been a priority because recovery's either, difficult or impossible.
Yeah. And the way I think about this, Rick, is it's not that you're really turning all the burners off. It's just which burner is burning it hot and which other burners are probably turned down a little bit. It doesn't mean they're completely off, right? Like,
Yeah.
you don't turn health completely off. You probably don't turn your family and friends completely off, but you turn those burners down when you're turning a work burner up or vice versa, right?
But I think we've all seen people who do that, and the price you pay, you know, the gift of life is you get to decide how to live it. The gift of life is you get to decide how high you climb and how far. The question is who's with you and what compromises do you make? And are they on board with those compromises? So one reminder in each of the four categories, if you're going to let one of the categories simmer, make sure you've got a plan for it. Don't just plan for, a hopeful, parachute one day back into that place. Make sure that you keep it alive and long enough that the peril doesn't outweigh the benefit of winning in another category. And, Elon Musk might be a good example if you've read his book. That guy sacrifices everything for work. Like that is his number one thing. And, I've he admittedly has challenged relationships, and I would only assume that a guy who works claims 100 hours a week probably has compromised health and friendships. And so the question is, are you operating by design or default? And if you're in a season where you're hyper focusing on something that takes 100 hours a week, make sure the people around you that you care about and love aren't completely disregarded so that you wake up, financially successful or skill based successful and then relationally bankrupt.
100%. It takes us to our second strategy is really you just assess your priorities, right?
Hmm.
So if you're in a graduate school program, you're looking to uh, get a degree as something that's quite challenging, you have to understand that that's your priority, and that's why those other burners are being turned down. Or if you're in your season of life where work needs to be your priority, you need to push to create success and financial wealth and all those things. You got to be clear on that priority. Otherwise, the unclear part would not allow you to actually focus and know when to turn things up, right?
Exactly, which, my thought there is one season of life, get really clear, and secondarily, then prioritize what lands inside of that season, and then create some, time bind that so that, because sometimes your habits become your entire existence and they're hard to break. And even if it's a great habit in a season, it may not be a lifelong habit to keep. And so get really clear again, as I said earlier, with the people that matter, make sure they're on board and supportive and cheerleading, or maybe even incorporated into that experience to make sure that you show up on the other side of success, as holistically intact as you can. But one thing's for sure, you can't be average at everything and excel in a way that, is noteworthy of a legacy. So there's valid compromise, but do it purpose built.
All right. Strategy three, create boundaries.
Mm,
And it's a lot of saying no.
mm,
And when you say no to something, you're saying yes to something else. We probably all heard that saying before.
mm-hmm.
And when you create boundaries and you're saying no to social events because you're saying yes to some kind of work priority, or you're saying yes to some kind of family priority, or you're saying yes to a health priority. Um, I think alcohol is an easy one here, Rick, for the analogy is if somebody's burning hot in health, they tend to say no to alcohol and say yes to health, right? And they're creating that boundary in their life and they're saying no because they're telling themselves I'm burning hot or I'm focused hot on health, right?
Yeah, and sleep would be the same thing. I mean, well, one, I'm dry January. Two, I'm also committed to not drink during the week, not because I'm opposed to alcohol. I mean, I love a good glass of wine and I don't typically excess. All that said, I've recognized a direct correlation between my sleep and alcohol. So recognizing what's an asset and what's a liability, and certain behavioral commitments become liabilities. And so getting clear around boundaries so that you maximize the efficiency of achieving the big rocks and the things that matter that you create, as priorities is paramount.
Paramount, paramount. The other
Paramount.
part of creating boundaries is setting expectations.
Mm. Yeah,
How, how does
without a
that
doubt.
play?
Well, it plays in two ways. One, expectations of yourself. Like get real about what behavioral attack, what really leads to the greatest return, which boundaries a big piece of that. The other is expectations around you of the other people. Again, what's what's the minimum amount or the amount that you have to keep on the simmer side, to make sure that the people you love recognize this is a win for all of us. And it's a little redundant, but I brought it back because I think it might be the most important thing you do. You just hear about people who, build corporations, build big businesses, and they double down on that. And then, at some point they've got regret because, their kids are like, I'm sorry, who are you, coming home late and leaving early and distracted the whole time you're around us? And spouses become disenchanted with your level of commitment and love. And it may not be how you feel, but the reality is how you behave is how they that's their interpreted feeling in many cases, especially if that person you love, if their love language is quality time, you better be extra careful to define what that looks like to make sure that if you're out of balance for a season, one, it's defined, time bound, two, they're on board, three, you are still creating sacred space for that exact thing, free of distraction, which is where boundaries paramount. And
Yeah.
it talks this premise talks a lot about making sure that, turn off your phone, hyper focused. It's not always time, in terms of quantity, but maybe quality. So make sure that you're landing in the quality box and that your priorities aren't bleeding into, the things that are supposedly important but don't appear or feel important to people around you.
Rick, we watch documentaries on Netflix or TV basically around famous people. And it's just popping in my head as you're sitting there talking about this. Some interesting examples, obviously, like Tom Brady.
Hmm.
Tom Brady chose to turn the burner up on work at the end of his career because that was his priority. But the fact that the other burners were turned off, he probably lost some relationships. He probably lost some other things. I also think about Cameron Diaz. She was on top of the world actress, right? And she took a 10-year hiatus, like didn't make a movie for 10 years. And what happened was is she had a child, right? And got married. And so she actually chose to turn that work burner down and turn up the family and friends burner for that season of her life. Now she's coming back into the movie scene and maybe she's turning that burner back up. But those are just interesting public examples of watching people that they turn burners up and turn burners down in different seasons of their life, right? And assessing their priorities.
Well, the difference between hyper successful and average is hyper focus for a season or a certain amount of time so that they achieve things others can't or won't because they won't invest that and they won't pay the price. And yes, and that's impressive that she would be that, deliberate in her approach. It's by design and not default.
Yeah. All right. Strategy four is where I actually feel like we start to make some progress inside of this because you could be listening to this conversation today going, man, I got to kill something in my life to win in a different area. And that's not exactly true. So, strategy four is to integrate the different burners. And I use the term stacking. You use what's the term you use, Rick?
Linking,
Linking.
linking or
Yeah.
stacking, putting aspects of each of the four quadrants together, so you get instead of 2x, it's probably a 10x in points scored because you're double dipping, if you will.
There you go. So, a couple examples of this. If you're in a season of life where work needs to burn hot, you could ask family members and incorporate them into your work. Another example of this would be if health is a priority of your life right now, you could invite your friends and family to participate in your health journey. So you're linking two different burners into one, or you're stacking two different burners into one. So you're accomplishing your priorities, but you're also able to not as neglect some of the other areas of your life.
That's exactly right, especially if there's common interest and everyone gets enjoyment from the experience. There's actually a guy I know that does a lot of cold calling and he crushes it. And he brought in a little treadmill that he walks on the entire time he's making his calls. So there's a good example of linking. The other would be taking trips. And if you do an adventure trip with health initiatives attached or hiking or things like that, and you bring friends and family, that's a triple dip.
There you go. And then the last strategy, Rick, is just simply be flexible.
Mm.
We're all having this human experience. And this human experience is not exactly linear and it's not
Mm-mm.
exactly a perfect formula, right? So you've got to give yourself some grace but you also got to give others grace. And once you give others grace, you tend to receive grace in return. But being flexible just means that we're going to change over time. I'll go back to that goopy analogy of the your friend all of a sudden gets in a relationship and then starts to neglect the friendship, right? Well, that's a season for them, and give them some grace. But at the
Mm.
same time, man, when you understand if your child goes out to become a lawyer and goes to law school, for example, you're not going to see a lot of them. Give them a little grace because that priority is that priority in their life right then. But at the same time, being flexible is more about us. And if we know that we're in different seasons, we need to be giving ourselves some grace and being flexible about understanding we're not going to be able to burn hot in all areas of our life at any given moment in time.
Yeah, it takes me back to the Four Agreements by Miguel Ruiz, great book. And two of them are one, don't make assumptions and don't take things personally. And that's easy to say, hard to do. But if someone in your world appears to be neglecting you or not showing up the way you'd hope, the assumption piece of it is have the I guess the guts to just stand up and ask the question so that you can clarify. And then if their answer is something they're on a mission to fix, solve, and cure something that's not related to you, don't take it personally. They're in a season. And I think by creating an environment of margin, you give them room to come back to the relationship when the timing's right. And it's one of the more beautiful things in life when people slingshot out and then over time they come back. And we've all heard it, a close friend from college or when you're young and all of a sudden they show up, it's like, you're like, we never missed a day. It's like the conversation, even though there was a gap in time, there was no gap in content. So creating margin for others is a beautiful thing. The other half of it is creating margin in your own life to recognize you can't be all things to all people all the time. And you can't be all things to yourself all the time if you're a loving, kind, generous person. There are seasons and reasons to take a step back, hit the delay button or defer, and then pay attention to the hottest burner on the stove, which, again, health scare, a family illness. Lots of things are going to show up as disabling things. And the key there, in my opinion, is honor your heart and do the right thing, but do it just long enough to make sure that you don't lose sight of your priorities and wake up with regret.
There you go. So just to recap, the five strategies are to know your season, assess your priorities, create boundaries, integrate different burners, and
That's
then
right.
be flexible. So,
Be
Mr.
flexible.
Hale, our listeners heard us talk about all this, but like, how do they make sense of it? What's the challenge this week? What would you challenge everybody to do with this information?
Well, you could use the wheel of life for the same approach or personal, experience. I say take an hour, time block in your day planner, maybe even 2 hours, and just take a deep breath. Write those five strategy. Write the four boxes down. Keep it simple: health, work, family, and friends. And under friends would be hobbies, leisure, and travel. Under work would also be financial investments and building wealth and personal development. But that said, make sure you get really clear on the priorities and then align with what season you're in and then make sure that you're applying the five strategies we discussed. Write these down. I mean, it's seasons of life. What season? Get clear. What are the priorities inside the four burners? What boundary are you employing and strategy to make sure that you're honoring focused energy to the ones that matter most? And then linking, how can you strategically and by design double dip? Because that's the secret to a life well lived, because you're bringing the people along that you love and you're serving and satisfying other burners simultaneously with one heat source, if you will. And then the last one's just be flexible and recognize that life's going to get messy and things are going to get in the way. And, that I saw this slogan on the back of a sweatshirt recently and it said, stop tripping on things behind you. And so I was walking through the airport. It stopped me dead in my tracks, Brett. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so profound. How often do we drag the past into the current and it becomes this anchor that just demoralizing or demotivating or, just it stops you dead when you're trying to rehash and fix things you can't control that are behind you and in the rear view. So stop tripping on things behind you, look forward, and then proactively design a strategy for the next season that's a winning strategy that suits you best.
There you go. So kitchen, stoves,
Did you
burners.
know? Let's go,
Did
Brett.
you
You're
know?
on.
When did the modern kitchen, Mr. Hale, happen? If you guessed, what's your guess?
I would have speculated at the turn of the century just because even though there were wood burning stoves, they had dedicated space inside a dwelling.
All
But
right, here,
but then
here.
if you go back to Europe, I'll add one disclaimer. They were doing things ahead of us. This is pre-electricity, but go ahead. What you got?
All right, so here you go. So they started in the early modern period, like 1500 to 1800, where they would actually like start to carve out portions of their homes for like cooking, right? But normally it was in an outbuilding or it was in the back part of the house because it was open fire type environment. But really, you got to realize the Industrial Revolution happened in the 19th century. So where appliances actually created probably weren't created until right close, you're right around the turn of the century. But the 20th century, Rick, is when the modern kitchen actually came to be, where if you bought real estate or you built a house, you actually put a kitchen inside of it. And they really say it became a thing in the 20s on to the 50s. So, really, between 1920 and 1950 is when the modern kitchen was born.
So I would argue that, and I'm certain of it. The better question might have been though. So if the definition of a kitchen was a dedicated area, maybe cavemen, I'm assuming they figured out fire. Like when was fire created? Even if it was outdoor, around a pit of sort, like
Yeah.
they were visionaries. I mean, outdoor living spaces right now are the rage, and having an
Yeah.
outdoor fire in a fire pit, I would submit that that dedicated kitchens have been around even longer than that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But inside the footprint of a dwelling.
In a dwelling.
Yeah, well, maybe it was a cave. I don't know. Rick Hale, weird conversation, but I love our topic today. Mojo Monday, my friend.
Have a great day, guys. We love you. Hope this helped.
I ain't worried about